Hi everyone, welcome to the penultimate lecture of the Shinto Foundation's Festivals and Fox Shrines course. This week we'll be looking at trends and trouble in Shinto today. You know me and alliteration, I couldn't help it. So this necessitates first considering religion in Japan today. What does the religious landscape look like? That's a little difficult to tell because the data differs depending on what questions you ask. Here's what we can gather so far. If you ask about religious affiliation, which religion do you belong to, that's a difficult question in Japan, right? So if you ask it, you get interesting answers. One is that the greatest affiliation is only 20%, Buddhism, and that the next largest one is Soka Gakkai, a new religion specifically branching off of Buddhism, and that Shinto is just 1%. How sad, right? But if you ask different questions, you get a different answer. This again means that a large portion of the population has no religious affiliation, right? Almost 70%. And a very similar percentage has a distrust of religious organizations, which again, it's not the only reason, but we can think back to the 1995 sarin gas attack by the new religious group Om Shinrikyo as partially responsible for this. But if you ask about religious activities instead of affiliation, you get a different answer. One is that the most common activity is visiting graves, right? The ancestral graves. So in a way that may have to do more with Confucianism and Buddhism, but there's still a large percent of the population, right? Another thing is keeping charms, those omamori, right? Those protective charms that you can buy at both shrines and temples, but a little more commonly at shrines. And that 30% of people visit a religious site, which again could be either a Shinto shrine or Buddhist temple or, indeed other religious sites, but that opens the field up a little wider. And this gets at this term mushukyo, which you've heard of before. We've mentioned it briefly. Literally, it means no religion, right? Mu is a negation, shukyo is religion. But it usually is interpreted to mean no religious affiliation, right? So when people say they're mushukyo, that doesn't necessarily mean that they don't have any religious beliefs. It's that they're not committing to just one, right? And that makes actually quite a lot of sense if we think about how syncretic and pluralistic the Japanese religious landscape is, right? Many Japanese do go to both Shinto shrines, Buddhist temples, and engage in activities from both traditions and don't see anything odd about that. But you can imagine that it makes it a little more difficult to claim just one religious affiliation. There are also a number of demographic problems in Japan today that do affect how people engage in religious practices. One of the huge ones is urbanization and a corresponding rural depopulation as more people move to urban centers like Tokyo, Kyoto, Osaka, but also regional places like Sendai or prefectural cities even. They're leaving the rural areas, which is leaving behind fewer and fewer people, especially fewer young people. And that goes hand in hand with the other major demographic issue, which is the low birth rate. Japan has one of the lowest birth rates in the world, and an aging population of, the Japanese equivalent of baby boomers when there were a lot of kids right after the war period. These are all now elders, and they're the ones who are remaining behind in rural areas. And finally, it's worth mentioning the demanding work environment that Japan is quite famous for. You might be familiar with the term salaryman, but when people are working, around 80 hours a week is one of the usual figures, that doesn't leave a lot of time to go to shrines or temples or engage in other religious activities. So these are all problems affecting religion in Japan today. So again, when we think about Shinto, these demographic changes become really important. Fewer youth also means fewer people who are going to shrines for the first shrine visit of a new baby, for the Shichiko-san festival for young kids, for things like weddings. And indeed, Shinto weddings are increasingly uncommon, partially because of demographic issues, but partially because there are other options that are more popular, some of which have nothing to do with religion at all, and some are Christian weddings, which might not really be Christian weddings conducted in a church, but have that sort of aesthetic. And again, these shifts are far more acute and thus problematic in rural areas. So many of the issues I've mentioned really affect rural shrines more than those in major cities. The issue of economic sustainability is a big factor, again, especially in rural shrines. If there are less people that are coming and patronizing the shrines, whether it's something as simple as buying omamori or leaving some coins behind, or whether it's commissioning these key rituals, that really affects whether a shrine can maintain itself. You also have some issues of organizational inflexibility, which you'll read a little bit more about in the reading. I'm not going to talk a lot about these, but you have a lot of individual shrines as well as the larger shrine organizations sticking with older models of how shrines should function, how shrines should make money, shrine organization. And so there is definitely a feeling that the Jinja Honcho, the Association of National Shrines, sometimes the National Association of Shinto Shrines, that's what you'll see in Hardacre's readings, that this organization is out of touch with most shrines and the problems they face. You also have the connection with nationalism, certainly during the state Shinto period, but also enduring connections and issues. So for instance, the Jinja Honcho actively pursues nationalist aims in terms of having a greater relationship with the state sponsorship for certain shrines or Shinto activities, and reinterpretations of history in terms of state Shinto being not that bad. And this definitely affects some people's perception of Shinto today. Also, how relevant is Shinto, or indeed religion, in society today? So one, as a religion, again, you have sort of this lingering idea of Shinto as not quite being a religion, but of course it fulfills some of the same functions that many religions do. So considering just the role of religion today. Also, Shinto specifically as a representative of Japanese culture, and many shrines actively embrace this in terms of putting forward Shinto as an indigenous Japanese tradition, but also having certain culture activities as the shrine. This is one way to engage with, sort of popular groups today. And finally, thinking of the shrine as a community space where community events happen, and the shrine as a vital part of the sort of support and community in which they exist. So Yasukuni Shrine is definitely a major topic of your readings, and that's because it comes up fairly often in terms of some of the problems with Japan and nationalism. So on the picture up top here, you see Yasukuni Shrine itself, and this image below, you see men dressed in World War II military uniforms with Japanese flags, specifically the imperial Japanese flag, in the same article that's talking about when the current Prime Minister Abe Shinzo sends offerings to Yasukuni Shrine. So the shrine was built in 1869 by Emperor Meiji, and it commemorates war dead from the Boshin War, the war that brought the Tokugawa shogunate to a close and initiated the Meiji period, as well as modern Japan, through World War II. And while most people don't necessarily have issues with the war dead themselves, the larger issue is that among these war dead from many, many different wars include war criminals from World War II. 14 of them Class A war criminals, about 1,000 war criminals total. And so visits from prime ministers to this shrine specifically often result in condemnation from China and South Korea, most notably in terms of this being an incendiary act, right? The head of the government going to a shrine that openly venerates war criminals. So in particular, the Prime Minister Koizumi Junichiro not only visited the shrine annually, but basically got elected on his promise to do so, right? There were a lot of right-wing groups that were really glad to see that. Something that you won't read about as often is emperor visits to Yasukuni Shrine. Emperor Showa did certainly visit the shrine multiple times before and after World War II, but he stopped visiting in 1975, which is not coincidentally when the last time he went was before the Class A war criminals were enshrined. So this process of enshrining the war criminals actually took quite a lot of time following the war. So it was part of really a nationalist agenda to do so, and emperors have not visited since this time because they do not endorse this sort of use of Yasukuni. So Yasukuni really remains this very powerful symbol of controversy on a few levels. One is the question of nationalism versus pacifism. Again, this ends up being very much a right-wing, left-wing debate in the case of Japan. Of really considering Japan's wartime legacy, what it means, what it should mean to Japanese people today. And finally, in terms of the question of separation of religion and state, these prime ministers occasionally will, talk about this being an active as a private citizen and not as a public figure, but they are public figures. So anyway, this is one reason why there's so much focus on Yasukuni. So there's no question that some shrines are doing really well right now because they're popular, right? And so what does that mean in terms of Shinto? So on the one hand, it means these are shrines that are having no problem with funding, right? They have tons of visitors coming and spending money. In particular, there's been a rather large increase in overseas tourists over the past decade. And while this is, kind of from everywhere, especially from Korea and China, because they're relatively closer, obviously, but also there's just been a huge increase in flights and easy ways to get between the various East Asian countries. So one problem this can bring for shrines is that those shrines that are popular with tourists can have trouble retaining sort of local worshippers, specifically the ujiko, or the group of families that are supposed to support the shrine. That said, many Japanese do tend to prefer to go to larger shrines, which also tend to be popular tourist shrines, for the New Year's shrine visit. So again, they can have sort of a local constituency in that way. There are also issues in terms of over-tourism stretching the resources of a shrine. Even a shrine that is getting a lot of money from tourism may still have problems with the number of people walking on and through their various buildings, wear and tear on the shrine itself as well as on their personnel. There also have been some fairly famous culture clashes in the past few years. One notable case of this is the Watatsumi Shrine in Tsushima, which is an island between Korea and Japan that belongs to Japan, but it's been part of a succession, property dispute between the two countries. And actually, just earlier this year, they banned all tourists because of what the priest saw as infringements on the shrine itself, including, it must be said, some graffiti actually carved into the side of the shrine. But so, the issue of, whether foreigners coming in respect the traditions or even know about the issues of Shinto is a large one. And certain shrines have done a better job of educating tourists than others. Certain shrines have done a better job of handling tourists, or, and others have, deliberately provoked Korean and Chinese tourists by putting up Japanese flags. So it's definitely a huge issue. And I'm kind of curious to see where this goes now that during COVID, obviously pretty much no one is going to shrines, and there's a huge dip in tourism, which may be causing some of these larger popular shrines to suffer. Again, they, presumably can handle it better than some of these smaller shrines, but it's definitely going to be an interesting issue moving forward. Oh, and there's Fushimi Inari. I don't know why it just appeared, but we'll go with it. Okay, so there's a very different issue with rural shrines who don't have the advantages that some of these larger shrines do. So for instance, this is a very small, two small shrines in Kawanoe, Ehime, where I lived many years ago. And this is a good sort of example of what many rural shrines face. For instance, when there are declining populations in rural areas, there are less people to support shrines, right? Less families, supporting the shrines with regular funds, and less families asking for the kind of rituals that you do pay money for, right? So this means that a lot of shrine priests have day jobs in order to make ends meet and manage multiple shrines. So for instance, I met the shrine priest in Kawanoe thanks to an introduction from a friend, and he was the shrine priest of 6 shrines that he, basically made the rounds of in order to satisfy the kami, but also, that was the only way these shrines were going to get taken care of. There are a lot of issues also in terms of shrine succession, who's going to take over these shrines, and you have, again, a few reasons for this. Whether they're economically viable, whether there's enough income from the shrines in order to be able to support a priest and usually his family. You also have the erosion of the family system. Again, in most cases, the priesthood of a particular shrine is hereditary, and you have less and less children willing to take on the position after their parents. So this is something that is, again, more acute in rural areas. It is worth maybe thinking a little bit about matsuri, however, and the matsuri can be a help or a hindrance in some way. So on the positive side, a matsuri that's popular among the locals can help support the shrines, right? This will bring everyone out, remind people of the importance of the shrine in the community. On the other hand, a particular rural area may not have enough people in order to perform the various roles involved in the matsuri, and that's definitely something that many communities are facing in terms of either needing to combine their matsuris, disband, or simplify them, and that can be a really sad thing for some of these communities. Another cheery topic, but it actually gets cheery at the end, so bear with me here. So the triple disaster, this is a term you don't find quite as often in English, but is one of the main ways that the events of March 11th, 2011 is referred to in Japan, because there were 3 different disasters going on, right? The earthquake, the tsunami, and the nuclear meltdown in Fukushima all, caused a different but huge amount of devastation. In the Tohoku region, again, Fukushima was the epicenter, but it's not the only area that was affected. A lot of prefectures, basically Tokyo North, were highly affected, and even Tokyo certainly felt the earthquake and aftershocks and had some damage. So it's interesting that of all of the different religious buildings, Shinto shrines were most adversely affected. So almost 5,000 were damaged, and 100 of them were completely destroyed, which is a huge loss. Yet Shinto was also really involved in disaster relief after the triple disaster. So one thing that's not often mentioned, but I think is quite important, is that many Shinto shrines, like Buddhist temples, are on higher ground, and therefore were the designated refuge areas where people were supposed to run or escape to in case of a tsunami in particular. Also, Shinto organizations, from the Jinja Honcho to individual shrines not directly affected, to, of course, the organizations of the Shinto new religions, all contributed a lot to the relief effort. Everything from funds, food, goods, support via relief workers, sort of representing Shinto. And the legacy of this event is immense in a lot of ways, but let me mention a few related to Shinto. One is that because of this event in particular, you see a trend in both Shinto and Buddhism for priests embracing more of a counseling role, or to see part of their role as comforting people, which is something that we think of kind of automatically as a big part of what pastors and rabbis do in the monotheistic traditions, but it's not something that's really been such a huge part of Shinto and Buddhism. So they're embracing this role, and individual sects and groups are also finding ways to provide them training, which I think is a really important thing. So I'm glad they're getting it. This has also led to a huge increase in Tohoku regional pride. Until this event, Tohoku was always, kind of considered a backwater of Japan, which, was developed relatively late historically and just didn't have all of the wonderful culture that we associate with Japan more with areas like Kyoto and Tokyo, right? So this really led to an upsurge in Tohoku regional identity, people from Tohoku pulling together, as well as a certain amount of anger at Tokyo, because a lot of the power, for instance, that was generated at the nuclear power plant was going to Tokyo, not to Tohoku. So that's a sort of negative aspect that I've mentioned right now, that Tohoku has kind of been shafted up till now. But it has meant that it has given a sort of positive view of Tohoku people towards their own traditions. And this includes things like Matsuri and no doubt also the shrines themselves. So a good example of this is the Tohoku Kizuna Festival. Kizuna means unity, and this is basically a festival that brings these sort of highlight festivals from the 6 prefectures that comprise the Tohoku region into one big festival. So this festival first kind of rotated between the 6 prefectures for the first 6 years after the disaster, but is now held annually in Sendai City, where I saw it a few years ago. Okay, finally talking about some materials for this week. So on Monday you have no reading. Enjoy Memorial Day. I'll still post the lecture. For Thursday you have a couple of things to read. Essentially all the reading for this week is from our different textbooks. So talking about, sort of problems in Shinto today, where Shinto is going, things like, the continuing legacy of Yasukuni Shrine. I want to point out for your reading on Friday, that it's, the final chapter from Hardacre's Shinto: A History, and it's called Heisei Shinto. That's because the Heisei period, which just ended last year, was for 30 years, and it coincides. It started at once Emperor Hirohito or Emperor Showa, the wartime emperor, died, but it also coincides fairly neatly with the Japanese economic bubble burst. So that's why this is kind of considered to be a concrete era. You'll have 2 videos on Yasukuni Shrine, which is one reason I didn't talk about it quite as much. And one is just kind of taking you through Yasukuni Shrine so you see the different parts of it. It's not a great video, but it does kind of give you that view of Yasukuni, whereas the other one talks about the various problems of Yasukuni. So you'll get kind of both perspectives. Finally, in terms of questions to think about this week, one thing I wanted to talk about was, how is the case of Shinto specifically and religion in Japan more generally? How does this compare with the situation of other religions and of countries around the world today? Are we seeing these trends anywhere else? If so, where? How do they differ from trends that we see in certain areas? Finally, we've talked about a lot of different areas, a lot of issues affecting Shinto and shrines. So which of them seem to be particularly difficult, things that Shinto might not be able to overcome, whereas others of them, might have some solutions, some of which we've talked about. Others, you might not have helpful suggestions that I can pass on to priests in Japan. And finally, just kind of a more personal question, but would you visit Yasukuni Shrine? Does it interest you? Why or why not? What are, some of the ethical implications of the shrine and perhaps visiting it that we might think about? Thanks for your attention, and I'll see you on Thursday. Have a great Memorial Day weekend.